turn it off. But we will record this so it's available to others if they haven't been able to make it today. So good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, where we are going to get in the weeds when it comes to grant compliance, grant record management, and planning for receipt of grant monies. By way of introduction, I am Bobbi Kilburn. I am Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation's Director of Finance and Grant Management. And with me also presenting today is Kris Plante, BDCC's Grant Administrator. Before we jump into the material, some housekeeping issues. I am working remote today and Kris is in the office. So I'm going to ask Kris to coordinate the PowerPoint presentation and she will help keep us all organized on all things Zoom related. And between the two of us, we'll keep track of questions that you may put in the chat. I do want to keep today's discussion sort of fluid and open for questions and comments. So please add any questions to the chat that you may have. Feel free to use the raise hand function and we'll unmute you if you'd like to just have a conversation. And we're happy to answer questions throughout the presentation. Everyone is muted just to cut down on the background noise. So either put the questions in the chat or feel free to just use that raise hand function. Next slide, Kris. Okay, great. So I'm asked all the time, why are grants so hard to administer? Why are the rules so frustrating? Why is each funding source, the terms and conditions different? Here's the reality. Grant money is not free. It takes a lot of people power. And my old saying that grants equal paper, be it hard copy paper or electronic paper, if you will, is true. If you want to access these types of funds, know that this is the reality going in. It will make things a lot easier if you just know at the outset that it's going to take a lot of work. Grant management takes, and we're going to talk through each of these sections in a lot more detail this morning. You need to have an understanding of your grant agreement. You need to read the entire agreement and all communications that come from your funders. You need to be organized with your financial processes. And if you aren't, or you need guidance on that, you need to go in search of help. This can make or break success. And the last thing you want to do is have grant funds that you're going to need to return because your procedures weren't appropriate. You will need to develop internal policies and procedures. You're going to want written SOPs or more robust policies and procedures as it applies to financial, how you're going to keep track of your grant funds, the grant management itself, and then time reporting. And when you apply for a grant and then you have communications with your funders, ask them what you need as far as written policies and procedures. Use them as a resource. You're going to want to keep your documentation organized. This is going to be a key to success. You're going to hear this morning over and over again. Organization is key. You want to set up a system for reporting, however that works for you. And we're going to give you some samples and some guidance on that as well. And then you also need to understand how long you need to keep grant and project files. So what is the record retention requirements and the closeout requirements? Some keys to success, and this is sort of my secret sauce, if you will. You want to figure out at the start of your grant process, either actually before you apply for a grant, how you're going to stay organized, what works best for you. If this isn't your forte, if organization just isn't something that is a strong skill set for yourself, rely on others. You shouldn't be in this alone. ask for help. If you don't have, if you're an organization with limited capacity, which I'm sure some of you are, feel free to reach out to others. That could be your regional development corporation. If you're in Windham County, you can reach out to BDCC. If you're in another area of the state, that's what they're there for. Your regional planning commission can also provide some resources. The funder, you're going to strike up a relationship with your point of contact at the funding organization. Use them as a resource. Other partners that may be invested in your project, they can also serve to provide some support to you. Set up systems now. So if you haven't applied for a grant, but you're thinking about it, set up your systems. How are you going to stay organized? How are you going to maintain your records? Who's going to be your project partners? Know that going in and set those systems up early. And lastly, I can't state this enough, over communicate. This goes back to asking for help. If you don't understand something in your grant agreement or the grant application, if you think you've received a grant and you think you're going to miss a reporting due date, let your funders know. They are okay hearing what I call the good, bad, and ugly. So everybody always wants to report what we're doing that's awesome. How is everything going? It's going great. But if something isn't, let them know early, and they really want to help you nip problems in the bud. So feel free to over communicate with your funders. Next slide, Kris. So you've applied for a grant, you've been awarded a grant, everybody's elated, these funds are coming in. Read and dissect your grant agreement and any communication that comes from your funder. And what you want to do is you want to sit down and read all of the communications. This is where you're going to learn what is or what is not required. And we're going to go through an actual grant agreement, and you'll see sort of how I approach dissecting the grant agreement. Shortly, Kris is going to do a walkthrough of system development and tips for success, be it if you're going to maintain your files in hard copy or if you're going to do electronic. And then we're also going to touch on establishing your team. You do not want to be in this alone. Next slide, Kris. So what do I mean about dissecting your grant agreement? Again, the agreement is your reality. It is what you are going to be facing as you fund a program or a project with grant funds, be it private foundation, state, or federal funding sources. The grant agreement is going to tell you what is required of you. So you want to read the entire agreement thoroughly, cover to cover, and probably more times, several times. You're not going to absorb everything at the outset. Depending on how you process information, regardless of if you print the grant agreement and make notes on it, or you read it online, you want to take notes, you want to highlight, really just, dating back to the days when you were reading a chapter in school and you needed to take notes, you want to really dive into it and do it the same process. You're going to want to know what sort of key items you're looking for. And I've broken that down here on this slide, but we're actually going to look at a grant agreement. And then whatever you do not put the grant agreement in a drawer and forget about it. You're going to want it sort of at your fingertips because you're going to reference it all the time, especially if you have more than one grant. So if you have, 20 grants, which for instance, BDCC does, I just can't possibly, and neither can Kris, remember all the terms and conditions for all of these grants. So you want them, sort of on your shelf, or you want to be able to know where to find them electronically. So I'm going to ask Kris to actually open up a grant agreement example. This is a redacted version. This information is publicly available, but just for ease, I redact it out. So this is a state of Vermont grant agreement. Generally speaking, grant agreements will have a cover page that will provide you with the grant number, the grant title, the amount awarded, the start and end date of your grant. You want to look at this and make sure it's correct. Everybody, we're all human and people make fat finger mistakes all the time. So really just take a look at this and see if it makes sense. And if it doesn't, go back to your funder and say, you've made this mistake. They can make corrections to all of this. So this is just a general cover page. And then, actually, Kris, I see Nancy has raised her hand. Hi, Nancy.
Hi. Yeah, you maybe gonna touch this later. So if it's out of context, we can go back to it. But I'm really curious about the end date, especially with some of the grants we're dealing with. Typically, people are saying that's the date that all grant funds have to be obligated, but the actual get the money out the door date is different. Can you explain that and also explain your understanding of what's the difference between obligated and spent?
Yes. So the award start date and the award end date are going to define when your costs have to be incurred or obligated. In other words, you have to have a contract that says we're going to spend $10,000 with this entity by such and such a date. So you have to have them sort of agreements on how you're going to spend those monies. That may not mean that you have cut the check for it yet. So that would be after the fact. So it's going to be dependent, each grant is going to be different. So they may have a date that says you have to have all the funds obligated and spent by the end date, or it could be, you know, they need to be obligated by a certain date, but you have 60 days or 90 days after that to actually fully requisition for it. So you need to talk with your funder to make sure that you clearly understand what their definition is of obligated versus actually spent. So that would be a question at the outset when you're reading your grant agreement that I would write down and make sure that you confirm with your funder, because every funder is going to be different.
Okay, thanks.
All right. And that's, you know, again, you know, back to this is the reality. Every single grant, even with the same funder. So for instance, BDCC, we have a number of grants with USDA. Every one of those is different. So it's the same funder, but the rules are different for each type of program. So that's why, you know, reading your grant agreement and establishing that relationship with your point of contact at the funding agency is going to be key, because that's, you know, there's no, you know, it's not black or white. It is always gray. So you need to be able to, you know, ask those questions of your funder. So Kris, if you want to just scroll down. So back to this, your grant agreement is always going to have a cover page that gives you sort of the general information about the grant. In the case of state of Vermont grants and even federal grants, if there are any other attachments, they will define that in the grant agreement. And you want to look at those because some of those are where your performance measures are going to reside. They're going to explain what your performance measures are under this grant. What do you need to achieve? What is this grant funding and what is it supporting? Is it a, you know, program? Is it a construction project? What does the outcome need to be? Your payment provisions are going to be in these attachments. How are you going to get your funds back? Generally speaking, unless it's a private foundation grant, most grants are cost reimbursement. So you need to spend the money before you get the money. In some cases, you can get advances, but not always. Your provisions for your contracts and your grants, if you are an entity that is going to pass through grant funds. So in other words, you are going to receive them and then subgrant them out. The provisions for doing that will be in your grant agreement. Any sort of special assurances are going to be in your grant agreement, and then any state or federal specific funding requirements. This is where, you know, this verbiage is where it's going to tell you, what are you doing? What is the purpose of these funds? And it will detail, and you'll see I've made notes on here. You know, what do I need to do? How are things defined? You know, I don't always know the answers to that. So I come up with a list of questions. I shoot it off to my funding point of contact and say, please clarify this. How is this defined? What do you mean by, you know, administrative services? Is it for these purposes? Very specific questions I would pose to them. You can see here, this is where the expenditure fund, grant funds is included here. Your terms of your agreement, what's the start and end date? In this case, they had a different end date in the grant agreement than they did in the cover sheet. So I didn't know the answer to that. I had to go find the answer to that. So there are, sometimes you will find inconsistencies. Again, you know, people are human and they make mistakes, or they don't clearly articulate something in the verbiage, and you need to get confirmation of that. It's going to have your point of contact. Who is your point person at your funding source, and who is the point person for within your organization? And then you'll have your signature pages. So you're going to know who's going to sign it and who is sort of responsible, who has the overarching responsibility for this particular project as far as the funder is concerned. Then you're going to get into the attachments. And this is, in this instance, this is where the scope of work resides. So what are you going to be doing? What is the project? What is the breakdown of the project? How much does it, you know, how much is it going to be allocated for each of these line items in the project? And, you know, again, this is, I'm just trying to reiterate, take notes, come up with questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And again, if you don't know where to go to get the answer, ask for help. Your grant agreement will also confirm what your monitoring requirements are. So how often is your progress reporting due? What's included in the progress reporting? And this is where the organization is key. So as you're reading your grant agreement and you're thinking to yourself, how am I going to stay organized? The two need to work together. And we're really going to get into how to do this in a little bit later. So again, here, right in the middle of this page is reporting. How often do you need to report? What needs to be in your reporting? You can see, you know, in the comments there, I said set up process. That means we need to take this reporting requirement and we need to come up with a mechanism to do this. What is it going to look like? And we actually at BDCC, when we are, after we get done dissecting these grant agreements, Kris and I then say, okay, we need to come up with a standardized template so that all you have to do is plug and play. And we do this at the outset. Okay, Kris, keep. Attachment B, this is where your payment provisions are. So how much money are you getting? When is it going to come in? do you have to provide anything prior to accessing those funds? So in other words, a lot of times you'll need to provide a W-9. You're going to need to provide a certificate of insurance. You may have some other requirements that the funder's going to need before they're going to give you that money. They need to they need to set you up as a vendor on their side and make sure that you are able to receive these funds. Then you're going to have all sorts of terms and conditions, you know, what is allowable under the grant as far as subgranting is concerned. What provisions do you need to pass through if you are subgranting? And we're going to walk through an MOU in a little bit here to show you how to do that. But all state and federal grants will have standard provisions for contracts and grants. So, and I don't want to say they're sneaky, but when all the terms and conditions that you need to pass through to a subgrantee are going to be embedded in here somewhere. That's why you need to read this cover to cover. And you'll see on this page here, this is a state grant, and it says at the top, revised December 15, 2017. It's very easy if you have multiple grants to say, oh, I've seen this before, so I'm not going to really read the whole thing because it's the same version that I had before. Read it anyways, because if you receive a grant today and it's a whole year, unless you have, you know, photographic memory, you're not going to remember all of this stuff that's in here that you need to pass through to your subrecipients. So read the whole grant agreement. And if you don't understand something, read it again and then ask questions of that. Each grant and each state and federal grants will have requirements for insurance. So you're going to want to read that section because you will, for the most part, have to provide a certificate of insurance. So you're going to need to make sure that you can meet the requirements under the grant. If for some reason you read these sections, especially for either state or federal funding, if you can't meet the requirements for insurance, reach out to your funder. Sometimes it's just required and you're going to have to go procure it if you don't already have it for coverage, but sometimes they can offer you waivers. So, for instance, workers' comp, if you don't have employees, you're not going to have workers' comp. Let them know that at the outset, and then they can generally work with you on that. So don't let that be a stumbling block. And keep in mind, if this is a multi-year grant, when you do submit your insurance, you're going to have to remember to resubmit it to them. So if your certificate of insurance shows start in April of 2022, runs to April of 2023, you need to remember in 2023, if the grant is still active, that you need to send them another certificate. That's on you. There's a lot of state of Vermont pass-through requirements that you may scratch your head and say, this seems overkill. It's again, this is just the reality of a grant. You have to pass through all of these provisions, such as False Claims Act, whistleblower protections, location of state data. You just put that in the MOU and pass it through to your sub-recipient. But you want to make sure that if you're sub-granting funds, that the recipient is able to manage their grant. So if you do an MOU and you are going to work with another entity, then they need to be able to administer the grant as well. So if they don't have that capacity, you do not want to subgrant to them, or you're going to need to support and provide technical assistance to them to make sure it's done correctly. Okay. So again, a lot of this, so here you're going to see, it will also tell you about your single audit requirements, and we're going to talk about that in more detail as well. But what is or is not required, if you happen to break the federal threshold of $750,000 worth of federal funds that flow through to your entity, what's required for single audit purposes. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail. So a lot of us are receiving funds that are a result of the pandemic. And with that comes, because those are federal funds that flow from the federal government to the state to you and I as a nonprofit or a municipality, we are also subject to additional federal requirements. That may not always be the case. If it's outside of pandemic related funding, you may or may not have additional requirements. So again, this is your grant agreement is your, be all end all as far as how you are going to set up your processes. So again, organization and reading is key. Okay. All right, Kris, I think that is good at this point. Great. Thank you. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, please. So once you've read your grant agreement, you've prepared all your questions. Part of your program and project setup is figuring out how you're going to maintain your files and the techniques that you're going to use to stay organized. So Kris is going to walk you through some tips for success shortly, but you'll want to think about at the outset, how are you going to maintain your files? Is it going to be hard copy or is it going to be electronic file storage? You're going to want to pick one. Have a primary location for those electronic or hard copy files to reside. What I would not recommend is you don't want each team member having their own files. You don't want, I don't have files and Kris doesn't have files and other people that are working on the team have files. Everything resides with Kris and I for anything having to do with the grant, the project, anything. And you want to pick someone who's going to be in charge of the documentation. And Kris will give you some examples on how we used to do it at BDCC and then how we do it today. Next slide, Kris. So you've read your grant agreement, you're organized, you have in your mind how you're going to set things up. As the responsible party under the grant agreement, establish your team of go-to support. You should not be in this endeavor alone. I'm not going to read verbatim the definition of a team, which you can see there on the slide. I know probably most of you that are in attendance today, each of you is unique when it comes to your capacity. Each of your groups may look different depending on the project. And I know probably most of you wear multiple hats. So you do lots of different things, but you want to set up a team at least so you understand who's going to do what. You want someone who is sort of your grant professional, who is going to administer the grant, who's going to be sort of the go-to person on all things grant related. You're going to want to figure out who that person is. If you're that person or whoever that person is, who do they report to? You want to make sure you have some type of check and balance. So I wouldn't recommend is you don't want to do the grant management, do the project management, process all the progress reports, submit all the reimbursement requests. You don't want to do all of that without someone making sure that you're dotting I's and crossing T's. So you need that check and balance. So figure out who that person will be. Who's going to be responsible for the financial administration of the program that is funded by this grant and other sources potentially? who is going to oversee the success? Is it a project manager? Is it yourself? Who's going to make sure that the outcomes of that this grant is, the project this grant is funding is going to be achieved? All grant funding opportunities come with some type of measurements. So who's in charge of evaluating how is the project going and reporting out on that progress reporting? Most progress reporting is going to have two forms, if you will. It's got the financial side, and then it has the project side or the outcome side. So for instance, I'm going to pick on Reagan because she's joined us here today from BDCC. She is a project manager for our USDA Community Facilities Program. She oversees the project, and then Kris and I deal with things on the financial side. So we all work together. She does one side of the reporting and we do the other side of the reporting. IT, as we know, is a necessary function in our lives. So this is going to be key. Who is your IT person, especially if you're going to keep your files electronically? So know who that person is if something doesn't work. Marketing, lots of times these grant funded projects have a marketing, or if you're at the municipality level, public involvement. So who is the person that's going to answer all things communications, press releases, public inquiries, all of that? Is it you, or do you have a communications person that's going to do that and maybe better suited to do that? So, the identification of your team is really sort of, I use it in one of two ways. I use it, as the primary point of contact for all grant funded initiatives at BDCC. Understanding who my team is allows me to know who to go to ask for help or guidance. Something isn't working. Where do I go? Who has the answer? It allows myself and Kris to sort of spread the level of responsibility when it comes to financial tracking, determining how the project's going, evaluation, and reporting and communication. So we spread the wealth a little bit. There are two of us that work on this, but depending on the project and what type of project it is and the funding source, there are many others that are involved, as I was pointing out what Reagan's function is. So with that, I'm going to turn this presentation over to Kris. She's going to do a deeper dive into records management and how to track grant expenditures. Please continue. If you have questions, raise your hand or put them in the chat. If we're going too fast, let us know. All feedback is greatly appreciated. So I'll send it over to you, Kris.
Thanks, Bobbi. Hi, everyone. So go to the next slide. When deciding to keep your records paper or digital, it is important to verify whether your funder has a requirement, how many grants you are planning on having or applying for, and who will need easy access to the documents. At BDCC, we keep digital records, but we do have a few funders who require us to keep paper copies in our office in case they come to audit. So for those situations, we have a paper and digital folder so that we can keep our system and process consistent. So regardless of how you're going to store your documents, you need the same information. As you can see, here is a summary sheet that I made up a grant for. It's a quick, easy way to see the important information on your grant. And before we were really using Asana or keeping documents electronically, here at BDCC, we had a summary sheet for each of our grants that was pinned on a cork board in Bobbi's office. If you're doing paper, I would also recommend having a copy on the front of your binder envelope or in your digital folder. So you will also need your grant agreement and grant application, and each should get their own labeled folder or tab divider. Each progress report and or requisition should also have their own folder, tab, or paperclip together to keep them separate. At BDCC, we generally submit progress reports and requisitions at the same time. But if your grant agreement allows for a different schedule and you follow that, then they should be separated. If you are keeping your documents electronically, which I highly recommend, each of the items should have its own folder. At BDCC, we have a shared drive, but Google Drive or something similar would also work. And if there are multiple people working on a grant, you want to make sure that the documents are somewhere that everyone can easily access and find. So I set up an example folder that I would have for a grant. You can see that I have a separate grant agreement, grant application. And then if we go into progress reports, you can see that I have it separated. And you can see the same thing for requisitions. In the requisition folder, you can also see that I have the forms that are required so that I don't have to go searching or try to remember what they are each time. So each grant should have its own separate file folder, binder, or digital folder. If you have a 2-year grant that you reapply for, it can be near the previous one, but it should have its own system. It is also a good idea to save your applications for the grants that you don't receive to reference later.
Hey, Kris. Nancy's raised her hand. Can we unmute her?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, requisitions are when you call for additional chunks of the grant. Is that what you mean by requisitions?
Yes. So when we each quarter we submit requisitions and reimbursements, they're synonymous.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, it's our
No,
terminology.
that's okay. That's okay. That's great. Thanks.
Great. And then there's also a question in the chat from Val Davis. I'm not sure I understand the question. Val, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand so we can get a little more information as to what you're looking for. Okay.
Okay, now you can hear me.
Oh, now we can hear you. Thank you.
So I'm just curious, I'm looking at the structure you have on screen. I would like to have, or will you be providing a PowerPoint of this presentation after we're done so we can go through this later?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, we will.
Nancy.
Nancy's hand, is that a leftover or another question?
Just another question. I've been keeping records of any communication I have with the contact person who's the funder contact person.
Mhm.
And so I guess I don't know where you would put that in this form, but I have found that when I ask a question and I get an answer, I'd like to keep track of what that answer was so that in case people forget they gave me permission to do something, that I have a record of it.
Of
Yeah,
course.
so some recommendations. Oh, go ahead, Kris.
I was going to say that I would just create a communications
Yeah,
folder or tab, and that's where I would keep all of that.
yeah. Thanks.
The other thing that I do too, Nancy, is, I mean, we use Gmail. I have a folder in my email. I keep every single email that anybody sends me, and it goes in that folder so that I can recreate it if I ever need to. And then the other thing that I will do is if it is of great importance, I will just PDF the email and throw it in that folder, as Kris just mentioned. So it's just another resource there. Okay, Kris.
Okay, so once Bobbi gives me the grant agreement, I read through it and highlight any other information that I need. Then I set up Asana and my requisition spreadsheet. So we use Asana, which is a work management platform that I find extremely helpful. But if you don't have a dozen plus grants, keeping on top of your Gmail or Outlook calendar would also work. As you can see, I have a screenshot of Asana here for one of our grants. And each grant will have its own section that is a little different than each one because they each have their own requirements. And I set this up for the entire life of the grant. And if I was doing this in Gmail, I would update my calendar or create tasks for each item. And I have multiple due dates for things. So for one progress report, I have one task or due date that's a couple of weeks before the progress report is due. I have one a week before the progress report is due, and then I have one the date it is due. And thankfully in Asana, I am also able to assign tasks to my coworkers, and I make their part of progress reports due at least 1, if not 2 or 3 weeks before the actual due date to make sure that I get what I need in time. So after I do all of that, I make my requisition tracking spreadsheet, which is one of my favorite things. And I will show you a sample spreadsheet. So as you can see, this first tab is the budget, and then there's a tab for each requisition. Most of our grants have quarterly reporting, but for the ones that have semi-annual or monthly, I would just update the dates to make sure that they match. So on this budget spreadsheet, you can see that I have the grant name, dates, grant number, award amount. Here we have match. If it's not required, then I would just remove this section. You can see we have our headers and budget here. This should match what was submitted with your grant application. If you have multiple grants for a single project, you could include them on the same budget. So I would either change match to the other grant name or add another section. And we know things can change from our original budgets. Maybe you got a grant and then had to deal with a pandemic that reduced your travel greatly. So you want to change that line item. In your grant agreement, there might be a section saying how much you are or are not allowed to reallocate without prior approval. It could be a percentage of the total budget, or you might need to get approval for all changes. But you can see here how I subtracted $1,200 from travel and added it to marketing. You want to make sure that this total down here is 0 so that you know you're not changing your budget amount. And then here we have the revised budget that takes our changes into account. Next, we have high-level requisition detail columns that total over here, so we can see how much was spent, and then we can see how much we have of a remaining budget. So some of the grants we get include a match. For example, this grant I used as my sample requires our match to be 35.2% of the amount we are requisitioning for. So you can see down here, I have it calculate what match we are looking for. For requisition 1, 1046, we're all set. But you can see for requisition 2 that these amounts don't match. So something has to change. What I would do in this case is take some money from the grant and move it to the next requisition so that we're in compliance. So here you can see we have the big picture of our expenses, but if you want to know how we got this $12 in supplies, is it one item, is it multiple items? We go to the requisition spreadsheet. Here we have grant name, which requisition number it is, the dates that we are reporting on. Again, we make sure that these headers match our budget sheet, which matches the grant application. And then at BDCC, we have a couple of ways that we report on our time. So sometimes we will have a payroll allocation that our accountant sets up and then I get journal entries for. Other times I review everyone's timesheets and enter the hours here. I have the rate and then I have my rounded formula so that we can get it calculated and correct. And then, so that $12 supplies, you can see we had $2 in postage and we had $10 in pens. And then if we go back to our folder that we had, you go here, we're in requisitions, we're looking at requisition 1. Here you can see that I have support for that $2 postage and the $10 pens. You want to make sure that anything on this requisition you have support for. So again, pay attention to your grant agreement and any match requirements. You will want a separate requisition spreadsheet for each grant or project. And in Excel, formulas really are your best friend and will make your life so much easier.
So Kris, a couple of questions.
Yes.
And I don't know this answer off the top of my head, but someone asked, how much does Asana cost? So there's a couple of things, and Kris may know this better than I will. If you are a 501c3 and you are signed up with TechSoup, you can access Asana as a nonprofit. So if you want to check that out, you can certainly do it. And then Kris, when you can purchase Asana with a number of users, and then once you go over that sort of basic level, then you have to pay a higher amount. But do you know, Kris, off the top of your head? No. So when we send these slides out, I'll include in that email some links for Asana. There's a ton of, if you go onto their site, they have a lot of training videos and that sort of thing. It is quite user friendly. So that's the first question. We will be sending this recording out, and we can provide this sample sheet that Kris just walked you through on her made up grant. So you'll have access to that. And keep in mind, we feel free to poach. So in other words, what I mean by that is, if we send you this document, this Excel spreadsheet, please feel free to use it. That's what we're here for. Thank you, Aiden, for putting in the chat the Asana pricing for others to take a look at. Let's see, where's the... Okay, there's a question, and I'm gonna ask Kris how easy it would be to do this. One of the questions, Kris, is if you have a project that is funded by multiple grants. So I'm thinking of our P3 requisition spreadsheet. How hard would it be to pull that up so they can see what that looks like?
It should be fairly easy.
So we have a project at BDCC. It's our Pipelines and Pathways project that is funded by, oh my, you'll see here in a moment, many different funding sources. So Kris is going to show you, here is the spreadsheet that she keeps track of all of this. So if you scroll to the top of that, Kris, in this spreadsheet, we have all the funding sources. You can see it, how much, the start and end date. And then as she scrolls down, you can see the budget and then all the requisitions. So this is a project that is funded by multiple sources, and it's funded by private foundation, employer, and state funding. So there's many different funding sources here. So this is, it can get very detailed and involved. Thanks, Kris. All right, let me see if I've touched on everyone's. Okay, there's a question, where is information on available grants located on an ongoing basis? I'm not sure I understand that question. If you want to raise your hand, it might be easier for us to have a chat about that question. And then Jane makes mention that there are many different ways. So Asana is not the only type of option out there. There are other things through Teams and other Trello as well. So it's really finding a project management tool that makes sense for you and something you're comfortable using. Can you unmute, Kris? Thank you. Hello.
Hello. Hey, we just wondering where can we still kind of at loss and where to fund the grant to start application. We don't
Oh,
even.
okay. So where to find grant opportunities? Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. For federal grants, you can use, it's called grants.gov, grants.gov. Kris, could you put that in the chat?
Someone already did.
Okay, great. That is where you're going to find access to federally funded sources for the most part. State funded sources, they don't have a nice place for that. So it would be through, for instance, if you're getting our newsletter at BDCC, we put any grant announcements in that. And then, just a Google search on grant funding opportunities, depending on what type of organization you are. It does take some investigation and outreach, but I would encourage you to reach out to your RDC. If you're in our area, which I believe you are, we can help you with some of that. So I would contact myself and Kris, and we can help you with that.
Also, if you're in the Brattleboro area, the Brattleboro Memorial Library has a system and people to help you with that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So somebody said ACCD's website at the state. Again, it's the type of funding you're looking for. You just have to keep checking back. They will put it in their newsletters. Okay, I think I've caught all the questions. If I haven't, if I missed something, please raise your hand. Kris, I'll put it back to you.
Okay, so at BDCC, we use QuickBooks, but any accounting system should suffice. You will want to confirm with your funder whether a separate account will be required to store these funds. You will want to set up your ledger, how your grant budget is. And if you have multiple grants and the option to create classes, it is so much easier to sort by class when doing requisitioning or seeing what you've spent or had income. So every month I run a profit and loss by class and compare it to my requisition spreadsheet. So if I was running a P&L report in April, I would run it for March and February. So I do February 1st to March 31st. In May, I would run the report for all of April and all of March to make sure that I'm not missing anything that may have been submitted for the previous month later on. So I check this against the requisition spreadsheet and add in anything that is missing. And then every quarter I do a complete reconciliation to make sure that the income and expenses match what is in the requisition spreadsheet for the entire life of the grant. The more organized you are when you set this up, the easier it will make your life later. And you want to try to be as consistent as possible, so it is easier to find what you are looking for. I always include, for naming, file naming convention, I always have it the same. I have the date, a period, the month, period, date, period, year, and then I have the vendor, and then I have the amount. So you want your file name to give you the information you need concisely and consistently. And I have had it where I was in a rush and accidentally saved a file in the wrong folder, but I know exactly how I named it. So I'm able to search for it and move it to the correct location. So besides taking your time, being organized and consistent in the beginning and throughout the grant will make your life so much easier when it comes to reporting, tracking, or looking for information later. Thanks, back to you, Bobbi. Bobbi, you're muted.
Great. Yes, thank you. My mouse went crazy for a minute. Apologies. Okay. So many of you will receive grant funds that you are going to subgrant to others. We touched on this a little bit earlier this morning. Under state and federal grant guidelines, you are required, if you are going to subgrant to others, to develop an MOU between yourself as the grantee and your subgrantee. So you would have a grant agreement between the funder and yourself, and then you would have a MOU or a subgrant from yourself as the grantee to ABC nonprofit entity. This is a written agreement. This agreement should include reporting requirements by the subgrantee, allowing you to supplement your progress reporting to the funder. So if you have reporting requirements to your funder, the entity you're subgranting to will also have reporting requirements. So they will report to you. You will put that together with your progress reporting and report to the funder. It will define how the money flows. So if you're receiving funds and then you are passing those funds on, how does that happen? Is it in one lump sum? Do they have to requisition from you or seek reimbursement from you? How does that work? The MOU will detail that. I mentioned when we reviewed the grant agreement that there are pass-through requirements. So if the funder is asking something of you when it comes to procurement, to certain terms and conditions, and you are subgranting funds, that subgrantee needs to also adhere to all the pass-through requirements that you're subject to. The MOU or agreement is also going to tell the subgrantee what you will be monitoring. When you subgrant to another entity, it is your responsibility as the grantee to ensure that the subgrantee has the capacity and the ability to administer these funds. If you subgrant to someone who does not have that capacity, it's on you. So you need to make sure that they have the capacity to do this. You don't want to set them up for failure. So we're going to walk through an MOU example here. I'll ask Kris to open it. And we at BDCC have several or many subgrant agreements. We developed a template for our MOUs. So pretty much all our MOUs look very similar, and it's a plug and play process for us. But you'll see that it's a contract-like document. It defines the agreement, the start date of the agreement, who the agreement is with. It will detail, apologies, I need to plug my computer in. Okay, great. It will detail the engagement of the recipient. So who is receiving the funds? What are their responsibilities under this? And then what are the responsibilities of BDCC? Scroll down, Kris. So you'll see that we have specific sections. What is the subgrantee going to do? What is BDCC going to do? Scroll down. And it's going to look and feel different. I mean, this is a pretty lengthy MOU because there's a lot of stuff going on. It could be much shorter than this. You will see here that we've defined what is the reporting and monitoring, when are their progress reports due to BDCC, and what time frame does it cover? What is the compensation? What are they going to get paid and how often? What do they need to do? What do they need to provide to BDCC in order to access those funds? Then you'll see provisions binding on the subgrantee. So whatever BDCC is responsible for and needs to be passed through to the subgrantee, it's defined here. This is a actual contract and it is signed. And again, I've redacted this, and you'll see here, you can kind of read that this is where the signature section is. And then we provide exhibits. So I always attach to my MOU the overarching grant agreement. So it's a copy of the grant agreement between the funder and BDCC as Exhibit 1. Exhibit 2, if you have a work plan or a budget that's part of the grant agreement, I always articulate this here so that all team members know where we're all rowing in the same direction. We're all making sure that we know what is the end result and the goal that we're trying to achieve. In this case, that it was a detailed work plan, so we included that. And then the budget. So if there is a detailed budget, we include that here as well. And this all comes from the application and the grant agreement. So the grant application and the agreement. And we have some extra pages. Thanks, Kris. Okay. So once your grant process, oh, okay, Nancy.
So I think you're saying that in the MOU, the there are attachments that outline not just the subgrantee's part of the project, but outline the whole project that the subgrantee is part of. Is that
That
what
is-
you're saying?
That is what I'm saying.
Gotcha.
We-
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we look at our subgrantees as a project partner for all of, anytime they're part of the overall team. So they need to understand what is the goal, the large goal that we're trying to achieve, and what is this grant funding? And then they need to also understand what is their specific role in that. So I provide both sides of the coin. So you've received your grant, you've had a successful project, everybody's happy, we're at the grant closeout phase. For all types of grants, it doesn't matter if it's private, foundation, state, or otherwise, there is a closeout process. So this is a process that takes place when the grant matures. It will be defined in your grant agreement as to what that looks like. But the purpose of it is to make sure that all final reporting is submitted. And generally speaking, when the final report is submitted, it covers the entire project. So from start to end. In your progress reporting that you're doing throughout the grant process, it could be quarterly, it could be semi-annual, and it generally just covers that point in time. The final report is a very comprehensive report, and it could, it could be many, many pages. We've had some grants where we've had to do videos, and if it's for instance, if it's a CDBG type grant, you're going to have public involvement. So it's going to be a little bit different for the funding source. So that's going to take you back to that grant agreement and what do you need to do? In addition to final reports, it's an opportunity to do a final budget review and a final way for you to access any remaining funds. Once you've submitted all of that information and any required forms that maybe the funder has, you want to wait for closeout confirmation from your funding agency. And this can take months sometimes. We have grants where we'll submit it today, and 6 months from now, I'm reaching out to the funder saying, hey, we submitted that documentation. Is it confirmed closeout? What's going on? Sometimes you'll get a letter closing it out. Sometimes it's an email, but you want to receive confirmation. And regardless of how that comes in, we save it. We do not move our grants out of active grants until we receive that sign off that they are fully closed out. Once that closeout documentation comes or email, we then take the grant in its entirety and we move it into our historic grant processes. And it sits there until the records retention period is done. Your records retention period is going to be defined in your grant agreement, and it's generally 3, 5, or 7 years. So you're going to want to make sure you maintain those records because that's your audit period. Next slide, Kris. So I promised we'd get back to single audit. And I'm going to try to do a high level, but happy to answer specific questions because this is kind of a nitty gritty detailed area when it comes to grants. So what is a single audit? If you are a nonprofit or a governmental organization who receives federal funding in excess of $750,000, you are required by law to have a single audit performed. So that includes an audit of financial statements and the federal award that goes along with it. What this audit does, and it would be performed by an auditor, it's not something you would do in-house, it really reviews how you manage the grant. It's making sure that you follow the rules and you use the funding from the grant efficiently, effectively, and for allowable purposes. The process for doing the audit is defined by 2 CFR Part 200. If you can't sleep some night and you want to read something that will put you to sleep, I would highly recommend. This is a go-to for that purpose. And the requirements for the single audit are really to ensure that you have controls in place to ensure you are compliant with federal awards. It's an annual reporting, and it looks at the expenditure amounts for the federal awards to make sure that it's in compliance with the grant that you've received and you've used the funds for a specific purpose, that you haven't used them to take a trip to Bali or something. It will verify if you have passed any of these funds through to other entities, that they have used the funds appropriately. And it details the amounts that were passed through to those subrecipients. This is also something that ultimately gets reported on your 990s if you are a nonprofit who does a 990 filing. It's a major compliance requirement for all federal awards if you break the threshold of 750,000. What I can tell you is that as a result of pandemic funding, we are finding that a lot of nonprofits and municipalities who have never had to do this before are now having to do it. And because just the funding that has come through. So some sort of tips for success: know when you're going to need a single audit. Do not be surprised. Keep track of your expenditures so that you know if this is going to be triggered or not. Just a note for folks: anyone that received PPP monies and it was forgiven, so it reverts to becoming a grant, those funds are not subject to single audit requirements. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. You want to understand your single audit compliance requirements. So you want to reference that grant agreement and the 2 CFR that I talked to you about just a moment ago to understand what the rules are. You want to know what you're in for, if you will. Your auditors will come on site to assess where costs were spent and if the spending was allowable. If you charge for indirect rates, if you're an entity that has an indirect rate percentage, if the indirect rate was approved by a federal entity, and they will also scrutinize compensation to ensure reasonableness and support for those costs. So when Kris was walking you through the spreadsheet and she was talking about personnel, they will verify that the personnel monies that you use these grant funds for was appropriate. They're going to look for timesheets or performance activity reports. They're going to want to make sure that your timesheets or those reports are signed by the employee and the supervisor. That is a big sort of area in which people get caught off guard, that they don't have specific time reporting requirements. So how do you prepare for this? First, don't panic. Meet with your audit team prior to the fiscal year end and say, I think we're going to need a single audit. If you know that there's some areas that you have some weakness, talk with them about it. Identify those areas early. You're going to need to prepare a schedule of expenditures that you use the grant funds for, and make sure it reconciles to your financial statements, regardless of what type of entity you are. You want to have readily available written policies and procedures as to how you use the funds for payments, procurement, conflicts of interest, so on and so forth. And then allow them access to your files and financial processes. Even if it's not in an organized fashion, they're going to need to dive into that and look and see what's going on. So, what happens if the auditors find something wrong? Again, don't panic. Generally, the problem can be corrected with a plan to fix corrective action on audit findings promptly. So, there is a way to fix this short of, really using the funds in a, an inappropriate way, which generally, is not the case. It's usually, maybe your policies and procedures aren't tight enough. Maybe you charge this or that to the wrong line item, or maybe you use some of the funds for unallowable expenses. They will help you work through that. Single audits must be filed within 9 months of your fiscal year end. So for a 6/30 year end deadline, your audits would be due March of 2023. If you're closing 6/30 of 2022, they're going to be due by March of 2023. Next slide, Kris.
Did you want to show the example?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I did. I forgot I put that on there. Thank you. So this is just, I'm not going to go through this. It's just 13 pages, but BDCC goes through a single audit each year. It's done by our accountants. You can see there. It has a table of contents, an independent auditor's report. We do our single audit in alignment, or in parallel, I should say, with our regular audit. So it's done at the same time. And they prepare this report for you. It's not something you're going to need to prepare. But right here on this page, which you can't really see very well, this is the schedule. So this document right here, you will have to prepare. And basically what it tells you is on the left-hand side is a list of all of the federal funding. Then you have to give them the federal number, and that's your CFDA number, and that will be on your grant agreement. It will indicate if it's a pass-through, so you can see a number of ours there, it was not, but some were. And then what the federal expenditures were, and then if there were any funds that went to, that were granted from us. So not necessarily a subrecipient, but we actually use funds to grant to another entity. So you would prepare this. And this document will need to tie to your financials. So you're going to need to get it from the financials. And then similar to audited financials, there is some notations and that sort of thing. Okay. If you are, so right here, let me see if I can find it. Yes. So in this case, BDCC had a finding. And if you scroll down, they found an error in our policy and procedures. So we have a written policy and procedure, and the Code of Federal Regulation had made a change to employee travel that, frankly, I just didn't get to updating in our policies and procedures. That's a finding. So they put it in here and I have to rectify that. So I come up with a corrective action, which is on the next page. I say to them, okay, thank you very much for finding this for me. Here's how I'm going to fix it and by when I will fix it. And that tells our funders that, we're aware of the situation and we are going to rectify it. You can see in prior year, we did not have any, we didn't need a single audit. If you are an entity that does not need a single audit each year, you are automatically considered a high-risk auditee, and that is just by definition. So the reason being is that if you have a single audit every year, they determine that you get better and better at it each year. If you don't, what they do is they say you're high risk, so they do more testing, is really what that means. So it's not necessarily, good or bad. It's just a more sort of invasive audit. Thank you, Kris. Okay. All right, let's move on to procurement. Okay. So generally speaking, federal funds and procurement with said federal funds needs to be consistent with 2 CFR subsection 200-317 through 200-326. Those are the procurement standards. I would highly recommend, if you get a grant, regardless of what type of grant, read this section of the Code of Federal Regulation, because it is going to detail pretty much everything that you need to know about it. So there's a link here that you can go to, and you can actually drill down into the areas that you want. Thank you, Kris. So there's a question. Can you provide a sample grant management policy? Yes. I'm actually in the process of updating ours. And so I will provide a copy of that. Kris, if you could make a note for me so I don't forget to do that. Thank you. And also, if you Google policies and procedures, there's a ton of resources out there. And again, don't be afraid to, piggyback off from what somebody has already developed. Make your life a little bit easier. Just, mold it so it fits your organization. Okay, back to procurement. So really, procurement standards, they are out there to ensure a few things. One, ensure that open and free competition, right? The funders want to make sure that nepotism does not come into play, that you're not hiring your brother to, do something, and then your sister, and then your uncle. They want to make sure that it is open and free for all. They want to ensure unreasonable requirements are not placed on firms in order for them to qualify to do business with you. That there's no geographical preference used when you are evaluating bids or proposals. That contract specifications may not unduly restrict competition, and they are, putting severe requirements on the part of a contractor in order to procure something for less than $10,000. It could be a service, it could be a product, it could be whatever. In this case, competition is not required. So what that means is you don't need to do an RFP or an RFQ process. It is good practice that you will use a good faith effort in comparing prices. So what that really means is that, and in the case of what we do at BDCC, is if we're going to buy something, a service or a product for $8,000, we will go out and get at least 3 quotes. That doesn't mean that we take the cheapest, but we make sure that they are comparable. And then we make that selection based on, we detail how we made that selection. So, we bought this product for $8,000. We had bids that ranged from 7 to 10, but we chose this because of A, B, or C. So we can always, explain why we chose it. Then there's small purchases, and those are defined. And for some of us, this is probably not considered a small purchase. That is $10,001 to $250,000. Competition is required. So for anything over $10,000, you are going to want to do some type of RFQ, RFP process, or some type of detailed comparative bidding, okay? And you want to get it from at least 3 sources. So for anything, for the most part, for anything over $10,000, BDCC uses a request for proposal or a request for quote process. We distribute it, and we distribute it widely. So we put it, for instance, on the Vermont bid system. We put it on our website. We may put it on partner websites. If we have a list of like technical assistance providers that we use for all different sorts of things. We would share it widely with them so that we get a lot of feedback from folks that might be interested in submitting a bid. If you're doing this for what they call reoccurring expenses, you can actually get price or rate quotes every 2 to 3 years. So if you're going to engage someone to do something over a 3-year period, you only need to get competition for that every 2 to 3 years. There is what they call sole source. So if you find yourself in a situation where a competitive proposal is not feasible for a small purchase, sole source can be used. And this would require the item or the service that you're trying to procure to only be available from a single source. It could be an emergency situation, or if your granting agency allows non-competitive negotiation. I've never had that happen. So for the most part, the only time we've used sole source is in an emergency situation, or if we've gone through the RFQ process and we've only had one response, which can sometimes happen, or no responses, which could happen. Competitive proposals, if you are purchasing something or a service or a product greater than $250,000, this needs to be a sealed bid process. So any qualified sources must submit formal written bids, proposals, or qualifications. Again, this would be an RFP or an RFQ process. And for your records, as part of this, you want to have the method of procurement. What did you use? What was your procurement process? The evaluation and selection process. How did you evaluate the bids that came in? The basis for the contract price. And then finally, final labor and overhead rates. Now, if this is a construction project that you are funding with a federal grant, Davis-Bacon, and we won't get into this today, but if you have specific questions on that, please send them my way. Davis-Bacon would come into play for construction projects. So the competitive proposal process would need to take that into account. Excuse me. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, concerns, feedback. We appreciate you all joining us, and feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, question. Do you need to? Yes, thank you, Cindy. So if you are engaging a service provider or purchasing a product and you are using federal funds or state funds, you need to ensure that that person or that entity is not federally or state debarred. And what that means is that they are paying their taxes, following the rules, and the federal or the state government has not said that they cannot participate. So you will want to check to make sure that they are not on the state debarment list or the federal debarment list. The federal debarment list is obtained through sam.gov. And that's one other thing that I didn't touch on, but for federal purposes, you want to make sure that the entity receiving funds is indeed registered on sam.gov and that they have what used to be called a DUNS number, is now called a UEI number. They've done away with DUNS numbers and they've now converted to UEI numbers. If you look them up on the SAM site and they're not there, you would want to encourage them to get registered on the SAM site so that they can participate in future federal. But if they're not listed, and you can help them do that, Cindy, or they can reach out to our office and we can help them do that. But you really want, if they're going to receive federal funds, especially as a subgrantee, they need to be registered on sam.gov. Jane, you have your hands up. Can you unmute her, Kris?
I did.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Jane.
Hi. Our purchasing policy says that for purchases, the governing board can authorize a procurement process other than a standard RFP in certain circumstances, which include where the public exigency or emergency for the requirement will not permit a delay resulting from competitive solicitation, or where the prior experience and knowledge of the vendor relative to the CUD or the subject matter is likely to yield a superior result.
So Jane, you're with a CUD?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So using what you have in place there, when you go to select, certainly if it's an emergency situation, you can go with sole source.
Mhm.
If your board has passed a resolution that says you can use sole source for up to a certain amount of monies, then you would just want to make sure that's in your files so that you can, when the auditors ask for that, and you need to make sure that your granting agency allows you to do that.
Okay. Thank
Okay?
you.
You're welcome. So yes, we will send out, we're going to do a few things. I'm going to send out the presentation. We will record it. So we'll send you a link to the recording, the slides, the sample spreadsheet that Kris provided. Did I miss anything, Kris? What else we'll send out?
The sample grant management policy.
Yes. Yes. And we will send that as well. And if you think of something else that you need, our emails are here. Please feel free to reach out to either one of us. We're happy to help and respond pretty timely. So if you sleep on this tonight and you think of something, please let us know. And I'll give it just a minute for few more questions. And Kris, if you want to turn off the recording, we can do that and stop sharing. That's fine as well.